Okay, friends, I really like to welcome you all to this special occasion on Iranian cinema, and the subject is fascinating, as we will notice shortly. Um, but allow me to say, of course, welcoming you all to this occasion. And I'm speaking on behalf of the Association for Iranica in Australasia. Um, and it is my greatest pleasure to see you and be in your company. Before I start, I would like to acknowledge and pay respect to all the indigenous of Australasia and globally, wherever we are, and acknowledge the great custodians of these regions. And also, it would be perhaps an occasion to pay tribute to the Iranian friends that they are in the midst of a testing time and very grave circumstances, that hopefully it would give them the opportunity to gain the freedom and equity that they deserve, especially the youth and women in Iran. Um, and furthermore, I like to say a few words about the association. Very briefly, the Association of Iranica in Australasia started in 2004. And I mentioned to Dr. Khosrowjah earlier that the incentive for formation of this association was um, Iranica, Encyclopedia of Iranica, and it was a source of inspiration. And as a result, that has been our mission to promote and inform the wider community of the rich culture of Iran. And we have been engaged since by having conferences, workshops, and collaboration with other institutions. And also, since the COVID-19, we have been engaged in running these virtual lectures, which covers quite a variety of subjects related to the cultures of Iran. Now, I would like to very briefly introduce our uh, uh, Professor Khosrowjah, and also our discussant is Dr. Moghimi from Sydney University. Um, um, Dr. Khosrowjah is going to present um, and discuss the book he has published on the life and also work of prominent Iranian film director Kiarostami. And he's currently teaching at the University of, am I right, St. Mary College?
College, yes.
Yes.
St. Mary's College.
Yeah. And he's involved in teaching the film and cinema studies. Um, and also, he has quite a track record of publications in many journals, and also this wonderful publication that he will introduce it to us and describe it. Um, I sort of save more details, and pass the more or less befitting introduction of the book to Dr. Moghimi, who's been kind enough to accept to be the discussant in this conversation. And I would say that, Dr. Moghimi is also a lecturer at the University of Sydney in Australia, and his field also related to cinema and script writing and studies. Um, uh, I don't say any further. I'll just pass it on to Dr. Moghimi, but before I start, just a few brief logistics for our audience. Please feel free to use the chat, when you have any question and raise that. And please, as I see it, put your audio on mute during the session. And then, of course, uh, Dr. Moghimi will start the discussion, and the Q&A session will be the time to participate. Thank you very much. Habib John, it's all yours.
Thank you, Master John. Hi, everyone. I'm Habib. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. Sorry, I need to share my screen. It's a bad habit of being a teacher. I always use the slides. All right. Can see my slides. All right. Okay. Today we are going to discuss Dr. Khosrowjah's new publication, the book on Abbas Kiarostami and Iranian national cinema. I'll just give you a quick and brief introduction of each chapter, and then we can start the main topics that I found interesting in the book, and hopefully we can discuss them today. So first chapter is about film as national allegory. This chapter examines Iranian cinema's role in shaping national identity. It actually tries to understand the relationship between Iranian cinema, national cinema, and national identity. It criticizes the Western allegorical reading of Iranian films. This is one of those ideas that we can find actually in all chapters. So it's one of the main pillars of the theoretical framework of the book. In different chapters, we have different and various examples of films, not just Kiarostami's movies, but also different filmmakers and movies as well. Some of them, especially Kiarostami ones, are explained and explored deeply, and we have close analysis of Dr. Khosrowjah on those movies. Some of them are listed as example to show a more broader and general argument on Iranian cinema and national cinema. So in chapter 2, Dr. Khosrowjah discusses global reception of Kiarostami's films. You know that Kiarostami is one of those, like many other artists from Iran, one of those critical ones. His films, he himself, he has really hardcore fans. Also, many people who criticize him too much. I say too much because usually it goes beyond his films and they criticize the artist, the filmmaker himself as well, because of his political perspectives that we can see in his films as well. This chapter challenges binaries of national, international, authentic, inauthentic. Authenticity, again, is one of those concepts that we can find in all the chapters, I believe. So I hope that today we can also discuss authenticity. What does it mean to have authentic representation of Iranian society? Is it possible to reach a kind of authentic representation or not? Third chapter discusses censorship. It tries to show that censorship is not just a top-down repressive force. It can be understood as a generative force. I can say that this is my favorite chapter. I recently published a paper on censorship in Iranian cinema that is shaped by these new theories of censorship, that how we can see censorship as a force that can create new ways of being as well. It discusses again different films, focuses on 10 by Abbas Kiarostami, and the fourth chapter explores cross-cultural representation. Again, here more we can see those critics on Orientalist perspectives and Iranian cinema by other scholars in the field, how to read Kiarostami and his films. And we can see Benjamin's theory of translation and the way that Dr. Khosrowjah applied this theory in this chapter. So I really like that we can discuss these three main points from the book today. First one, national cinema. What is national cinema? Is it still a useful concept in this globalized world or not? Second one, authenticity, as I told you, is one of those key terms in the book. And it would be good if we can critically review this concept to see what do we mean by authenticity and if it's even possible to reach a kind of authentic representation. And third one, exploring censorship as a generative force to see how this generative force is shaped, what are its main pillars, and what are the consequences of having a language shaped by censorship. But again, like Master John, I also want to invite you to join the discussion, write your questions in the chat, or just join us. Yes, I just pass it over to Dr. Khosrowjah, and you're ready to listen to your presentation. Thank you.
Well, thank you, dear Professor Moghimi. That was something that I will from now on use to summarize my own book because that was brilliant. Thank you. It was very thoughtful. It was very concise, and it actually kind of like aimed at the heart of the matter, which is something that I care about. What is at stake? That is always the main question. So thank you very much for that summary and the questions that you raised. All right. Similar to Professor Moghimi, Dr. Moghimi, I'm going to share my screen and do a, give me a moment. Slideshow, current slide. Okay, let me start with a little preface. I'm going to go over the chapters in more detail. I'm going to sometimes talk about the overall and overarching ideas in the book. And I'm starting with this map because I'm going to just say a sentence about what's going on right now. I would like to express my gratitude to the Association of Iranica in Australia and New Zealand, I understand, especially to Masood Habib and Habib Aziz for this invitation. I would also like to thank all the attendees at tonight's meeting, especially in these dark and ominous days. Strange days indeed. I will start with the most heartfelt condolences to my compatriots, fellow Iranians. We are all heartbroken and anguished over the losses that we have suffered, but we will survive and thrive like we have for thousands of years. It's a pleasure to offer an overview of my work, but allow me to preface the talk with a few observations and a few memories. All right, let me start with just making a few remarks about my book. I wanted to also say that if anyone is interested in a broader discussion about what I actually took out of my talk, which is about the relationship between media representation, events that are happening right now, and what is actually featured in my book, I refer to an essay that I wrote 14 years ago in 2011 in a journal called Arab Studies Quarterly, called A Brief History of Area Studies, Area Studies and International Studies. And in this talk, I was actually talking about how academic disciplines are mobilized and usually brought into organization of public policy, and how area studies actually came into existence after World War II. So that's something that I recommend for anybody to read. One more plug, and that is an essay that I have in this book that was published in November, Trends in Iranian Cinema. It was edited by Behrooz Mahmoudi Bakhtiari and Mahmoud Rahmati. I only have a chapter, but the book is really layered and deep. It's a cross-disciplinary sociological study of post-revolutionary Iranian cinema. My own essay is about child-centered films of the 1980s and 1990s, and their um, and their and their gradual transition and transformation to troubled youth films of the 2000s. So check it out. It's a very interesting book, and if you can order it for your institutions or buy it yourself, that would be great. It's from the same publication, Bloomsbury, that was published in November of 2024. Okay, let me actually go and say a few things about the book that I think would put it into a broader context. It looks like a monogram, but it is more expansive, as Dr. Moghimi described it. Definitely was, the way that he approached it, it's not a biography. It is more of an overview using the works of Kiarostami as exemplary cases. It is volume 1 of 2 volumes. In this volume, I stop my consideration with the film 10. It would have been too big. So films like Shireen, Certified Copy, like Someone in Love, his museum pieces will be in 5 dedicated to Uzu, and a few other things will be in volume 2 that I'm working on right now. The book has been described as a timely exploration of local and globalized identities, an examination of the contemporary emerging and evolving cinematic forms, and a cross-border reception and interpretation of Iranian national cinema. But there is more, and I will describe it. Okay. So let me actually start with a memory. First, traveling Iranian film festivals in the US, and I assume in the West and also in Australia and New Zealand, were screened in the early 1990s. Actually, I think the first ones were screened in 1989, from what I remember. In Boston, my adopted hometown at the time, they were screened at Harvard's Carpenter Center and Boston's Museum of Fine Arts, where I saw Kiarostami, Makhmal Baf, Forouzeh, Ali Reza Davud Nejad, Beyzai, Bani Etemad, and others for the first time. Beyzai was not the first time, but the rest I was seeing for the first time. The experience was epiphanic. It was an epiphany. It was epiphanic. Emotionally, intellectually, I felt naked. At the time, I was an engineer, but the viewing experience basically changed my life. A decade later, I had a master's degree in cinema studies and was writing a PhD dissertation on the reception of Iranian cinema across geographic borders. Using Abbas Kiarostami's films as exemplary cases. The dissertation became the embryo of the current book. I wanted to explain why a middling, and by middling I mean average, below average, middling film critic by the name of Harlan Kennedy from Film Comment dares to make the following statement about Iran after a similarly middling film. The Circle, quoting myself, The Circle, Golden Lion winner, no, this is Harlan Kennedy, sorry, but it's quoted from my book. The Circle, Golden Lion winner as best film, does a La Ronde. La Ronde is a reference to Max Ophuls' famous film from 1950s, with its portmanteau picture of persecuted women in the patriarchal New Persia. Little has changed there since Alexander the Great. Men still wage wars, make laws, enact punishments, but the monster religiosity underpins it all. Circularity is the name and game, a camera endlessly panning around to record the impelling, entrapping disempowerments, the rights of non-passage. That are Iranian life for women, the unchosen. This is from Harlan Kennedy, a 2000 article in Film Comment. Did Kennedy exact all this, all that, everything that he says, all that from a film? This is where it dawned on me that film from exotic cultures, and by that I mean when there is so little known about the culture, let's say in the West, any single artifact from the museum objects to a fiction film are all conflated to act as localized ethnographies. This is why and how Kennedy gave himself, his passed on since then, gave himself the right to utter those pronouncements. Actually go to this. Okay, so this comes to the fact that people seeing these films actually make a generalization, sometimes universalization. I remember seeing the And Life Goes On, or was it Through the Olive Trees? I forgot what the film was. I think it was Through the Olive Trees, with some friends, American friends in Rochester, New York. And my companions asked me, does all of Iran look like this? So the assumption was that when you see a film that actually, is a representation of the entire culture. Okay. Very well. Now I'm going to read a passage from my own book. This book is a close examination of the role of Iranian national cinema in the constitution of national identity, both within and across geographic national boundaries. What is at stake here is how the meaning and force of terms such as nation, national identity, national character, and nationalism may best be understood as being simultaneously, locally, and globally constructed. Of course, this multi-sidedness, and Professor Dr. Moghimi referred to that, theory by George E. Marcus, multi-sidedness ethnography. I'm going to explain it more. This multi-sidedness also implies conflicted and contested meanings. Iranian national cinema is emblematic of this situation. The highly visible presence of post-revolutionary Iranian films in transnational film culture has generated provocative debates in relation to the question of authenticity of the cinematic representations of Iran. Questions and debates about this post-revolutionary cinema mirror all aspects of this period's culture and politics. Are rural, child-centered narratives of the 80s and 90s misrepresentations of Iran? Are middle-class urban melodramas more authentic constitutions of reality in a densely populated megapolis like Tehran? How are politics present in the cinematic text? How did the enormous international film festival's success and academic interest shape the reception of Iranian cinema domestically and locally? Similarities and differences among the wide range of positions expressed and knowledge produced in response to the above questions highlight the situatedness of these positions. And by situatedness, I'm referring to the fact that it depends on who asks the question and tries to answer the question. Where is the inquiry and the inquirer? In other words, the divergent interpretations and attitudes reflect the difference in the reception of this new Iranian cinema as experienced in radically different ways by the exilic Iranian communities in the West and Iranians living in Iran. Moreover, such instances of reception is also mediated by transnational reactions to contemporary Iranian films, including film reviews, international awards, and debates regarding censorship, religion, and politics. The following anthropological metaphor is a useful way of thinking competing models of cultural formations and national identity. Citing Ernest Gellner, anthropologist Ulf Hanners suggests two contrasting ethnographic maps as metaphors for cultural change. Gellner describes one of them as a map that resembles a painting by Kokoschka. Now, if you're familiar with the secession artist of Vienna, of early 20th century Vienna, you remember that Kokoschka's painting were kind of like explosions of the figures and situations. Nothing actually seemed to be contained by lines. Everything seems to kind of interact with each other. Kind of like through us, everything was just seeping into or bleeding into other parts of the figures. The riot of diverse points of color is such that no clear pattern can be discerned in any detail, though the picture as a whole does have one. A great diversity and plurality and complexity characterizes all distinct parts of the whole. The minute social groups, which are atoms of which the picture is composed, have complex and ambiguous and multiple relations to many cultures, some through speech, others through their dominant faith, and others still through a variant faith or a set of practices, a fourth through administrative loyalty, and so on. Hanners describes Gellner's other map as one resembling a painting by the Italian painter Amadeo Modigliani, with very little shading, neat, flat surfaces, clearly separated from one another. Gellner links the first map with its unclear patterns and indeterminate boundaries with a pre-nation state age, and the second with its clear separation and emphasis on modularity with the age of nation states and nationalism. However, the Kokoschka metaphor could also apply to the nations in the age of globalization, where the internet and social media, large patterns of population, movement, migration, exile, asylum, refugee, all the terms that are used for dislocation, and there's a hierarchy in those terms. And instantaneous access to media have made borders porous again. When we return to the international reception of Iranian cinema, are we looking at a Kokoschka or a Modigliani? Should one privilege the boundedness of a national cinema, its relationship to the dominant characters of the national culture, and its role in the construction of Iranian national identity? Or inversely, in light of porousness and permeability of the transnational film culture, should the global circulation of film culture be emphasized? In the latter case, national identity is necessarily negotiated in transnational arena. I also do a brief review of current sorry, shouldn't go there yet, of the current publications on Iranian cinema in general in that introduction, questions of gender and censorship in Iranian cinema, and Abbas Kiarostami's cinema in particular. It is a last-minute addition because I already had covered the literature, but when the book was going under publication, the publishers asked me to update my literature review. It's a last-minute addition because when I started my project, there was not much in the field, or I had already covered it. But by the time the book was going to press, apparently there was a body of work that needed to be considered. What I noticed was that various contributions were exploring new and novel aspects, some different from my own interests, like humor, representations of the city. And this is a fact to be celebrated. Somewhere, actually, ironically, we're using my own terminology and my own ideas, some were referencing my work, some were not. So it turned out that my own work had already kind of like dispersed in the field. So I found that very amusing. I didn't get upset. When I read people using my writings, I consider it just an epistemological fact. Sound arguments hopefully spread. And I like that when it happens. And feel free to quote me without, without feeling, just use my ideas freely. In chapter 1, I discuss film as a national allegory. Dr. Moghimi pointed that out. How the cinematic nation is imagined within and without national borders. The path from textual particulars to cultural universals. Remember that Harlan Kennedy quote that I read earlier? I start the chapter with that quote and proceed to unpack the question of films as provisional ethnographies. Monster religiosity underpinning it all? I ask rhetorically. What does all mean? What does it mean? Sorry, I'm not doing Bill Clinton, that what does mean. What I mean is that what is the vagueness of it and all? Why is Kennedy, a film journalist, compelled to issue such sweeping declarations on the entirety of a culture based on fictional melodrama set in his contemporary 2000, Tehran? What in particular, what circular episodic structure of a film portraying a day in the life of several women just released or on furlough from prison justify such universal certainties about the history of a people? That is, if Kennedy is strictly discussing history and not the nebulous region between history and myth. The most troubling part of this statement is that the historical reference point is not even an Iranian or Persian event or figure, but rather a Macedonian Greek leader and his conquest of the Persian Empire and the trail of destruction that he left behind. So in a way, Harlan Kennedy seems to be kind of like exerting sort of a colonial conquest by invoking Alexander. When historical details are elided, terms such as patriarchal Persia, law, and change are used as if their meanings are transparent and self-evident. Kennedy's review represents Iran anachronistically, being out of time, anachronistically called Persia here for dramatic effect, as always already dominated by a theocratic Islamic state, leaving out the very important detail that Persia, Iran, at the time of Achaemenid Empire, 550 BCE to 330 BCE, a polytheistic society with Zoroastrianism as a dominant religion, was a very different place from what it is today. Even if Kennedy means just the patriarchy and not the religious supplement, it is an ahistorical picture of patriarchy that could only exist in a land without history, a place where little has changed, quote, little has changed since changed there since Alexander the Great. This is the kind of universalization of patriarchy that troubles Judith Butler so much. Quote, the very notion of patriarchy has threatened to become a universal concept that overrides or reduces distinct articulations of gender asymmetry in different cultural contexts. The feminist recourse to imaginary past needs to be cautious not to promote a problematic reification of women's experiences in the course of debunking the self-reifying claims of masculinist culture. A well-intentioned, end of quote, a well-intentioned and sympathetic, as well-intentioned and sympathetic as Kennedy sounds or tries to be toward the plight of Iranian women, his invention of an imaginary past is a conventional Orientalist trope. After an analysis of the film, I realized that this type of allegorical interpretation is much more widespread. Many Western critics and much of the Western public read Iranian films as national allegories. In other words, the film narratives and plots are deprived of the particularity and are often pressed to function as universal representations. There is also a realization on my part that, in a sense, Kennedy is talking about me, Hossein Khosrowjah, me, or most of you sitting here. Or more accurately, he is theorizing me. However, upon closer examination, it is not really me he is discussing, but rather a fantasy that leaves me entirely out of the account. To paraphrase Edward Said in Orientalism, the Persia Iran of the review is an invention and part of an imaginary Orient that has often served as the other to the Western self, couched in Orientalist feminist rhetoric. And that's a very important term. I will use it more often in my next book. I want to credit Professor Roxana Bahramitash for coining the term feminist Orientalism, Orientalist feminism. Rhetoric, the Persia that Kennedy reconstructed for his readers in the review is a place outside of history. It is somewhere else, a place where little has changed in 2,300 years, decoupled from temporality. Of course, as I argued above, Panahi's film itself does invite, and that's key, because the film itself has to, or most often, offers a cue, a hint, offers an invitation for an allegorical reading. But still, why this particular allegory of social status? All right. The last two sections of the chapter are dedicated to an historical overview of the history of Iranian cinema, and a thorough analysis of Mohsen Makhmalbaf's Once Upon a Time cinema, aka Nasseruddin Shah, actor cinema, the cinema actor. The pastiche collage character of the film makes a perfect foil for a film that samples a wide swath of genres and canonical films of Iranian cinema. Of particular importance is the opening sequence of the European journey of the royal court. I analyzed the archival footage in the sequence as an instance of the reversed gaze. It is the purchased cinematograph purchased by Muzaffaruddin Shah and used by Abbas Bashi, court photographer, looking at the Europeans, looking at Iranians, looking back at them. So this sort of a Russian doll, reversal of gazes is something that I found very interesting, and I have already, I treated at much length in the chapter. All right. After, sorry, go back here. After the above preliminary remarks on the conceptual frameworks of the representations and cross-cultural receptions that structure a cinematic version of Iranianness, both within and outside of national boundaries, I examined in the remainder of the chapter 2 formative moments of cross-cultural encounter and used them to analyze characteristics of contemporary Iranian cinema, the reception of post-revolutionary Iranian cinema, and the manner in which the national cinema has become a site where Iranian national identity was contested, defined, and redefined. 2, through a close reading of Makhmalbaf's Nassereddin Shah, I discuss the introduction of cinematic technology to Iran. A witty, self-reflexive time travel narrative, Makhmalbaf's film is about the purchase of Iran's first cinematograph in Brussels during the 1900 exposition. I actually found an error in my own book. It should be Brussels, not Paris. The introduction of that technology to Iran and the resultant cultural and political transformation. The story of the cinematographer ensnared in court intrigue is the interwoven montage with quoted, borrowed scenes from a century of Iranian cinema. The film's circular postmodern structure collapses a linear historical periodization and offers an alternative to the technological developmental model of film history. In its place, Once Upon a Time cinema emphasizes extent that our present attitude determines our mapping of the past. Okay, so I spent the rest of the book in the subsequent chapters to explore the reasons for these particular allegories, as well as films of Abbas Kiarostami, as a special case of a filmmaker and artist whose work intentionally and consciously, actually I'm doing well with time, intentionally and consciously resist allegorization and universalization. In that regard, I look at at formal traits of Kiarostami's films, including the use of non-actors, improvised, spontaneous story developments instead of dramatically structured ones, improvised dialogues instead of polished ones. And in that regard, I don't have it in my notes, but I have it in the book, that I talk about miscommunications, people mishearing each other, repetitions of the same sentences. So communication is always somehow blocked or filtered or never smooth, instead of polished ones. A general de-dramatization of narratives, a general avoidance of conflict resolution. The most dramatic things that you will find at the end of Life and Nothing But is whether the Renault can make it up the hill or not whether what the film shows, not whether he will find the kid Babak the director finds Babak or not. De-dramatization of the narrative, a general avoidance of conflict resolution, placement of camera not to serve the narrative, but according to ethical consideration. And that actually is one of my favorite things about a lot of Kiarostami's films. The motorcycle ride at the end of Close Up, in which the sound breaks down, or in the same film, Close Up, where the taxi driver and one of the officers stay outside of the perimeter of the Ahankhaz house, not going in, even though the action is actually taking place there. So these avoidances of the space that seems to be brought in as a space that whether it is going to be traversed or not is one of the questions that almost becomes an ethical question in Kiarostami's films. And finally, my book suggests a kind of realism and truthfulness in Kiarostami cinema, which is fundamentally different from classical cinemas. I'm sorry, I'm going to use Michael Fisher's term, but not that I have any problems with it, but I don't use it in the book, but I'm saying it here. Michael Fisher's term, capitalist realism. But it's also not the strategic realism of Brecht's Verfremdungseffekt, or alien distanciation or alienation effect. It is not Godardian self-reflexivity either. It is rather an expanded cinematic truth that encompasses both the mise en scène, what unfolds in front of the camera, and what takes place behind the apparatus. So I actually have two favorite scenes that I would like to share, and I point them out in my book. One is in Life and Nothing But, And Life Goes On. Both titles are valid. Where Mr. Ruhi asks for a glass of water to give to a thirsty Puya. And we see Puya in the doorway right here. The breaking of the diegetic illusion, we see the assistant director coming in to hand in a bowl of water, and then goes back. And this breaking of the diegetic illusion does not last long, and the episode becomes its own event. So this actually is not something that is kind of like this doesn't make the film appear as somehow completely breaking the narrative structure of the film. The second one is the appearance of camera in homework. The camera is not so much about the appearance is not so much about the bearing of the device, the Brechtian technique, as much as it is about the contextualization of the circumstances of the recorded answers by 7, 8, 9-year-olds to the questions raised by Kiarostami. What's the meaning of giving a reward? What's the meaning of punishment? If they look petrified most of the time, it is the looming, intimidating camera and mic stand that seem to pierce through the kids' defenses and emotional barricades. Kiarostami's light touch, humor, and ineffable authenticity, here's that word again, for Dr. Moghimi, always make his formalist decisions appear as belonging where they are, as opposed to ruptures or disjunctions. Okay. The rest of the chapter is spent on exploring the domestic and international responses to the film. An overarching theme in my book is the exilic, diasporic Iranian community's culture and self-identity. Therefore, so I use the occasion of exploring films of Kiarostami, reactions to them, Iranian national cinema, the post-revolutionary cinema, also to talk about the national identity. And part of that is the exilic diasporic communities that the numbers could exceed 10 million people. So it's quite considerable. Therefore, I provide a space and analyze carefully the reactions of Iranian scholars, critics, and artists abroad. In the particular case of Iranian exilic community, the traumatic event, let me actually go here, the traumatic event of the 1978-79 revolution and its violent aftermath created a palpable tension between the exiles' attempts to cope with the facticity of their uprootedness and their need and desire to settle and re-territorialize in a new place. Here I'm using Heidegger's concept of facticity and also thrownness also fallenness, intentionally, because as a moment of Dasein, being in the world, there is much potential here that is helpful in understanding the nature of exiles being there, according to Heidegger. The concept, according to Heidegger, being there. According to Heidegger, the concept of facticity and thrownness imply that an entity within the world has being in the world in such a way that it can understand itself as bound up in its destiny with the being of these entities which encounters within its own world. Suddenly finding himself thrown into an existential chaos, a sort of fallenness verfallen, the exile's vegetative organic appeals to roots and a sense of nationalism become entirely endeavors to uncover his ontological origin. What makes him who he is, a being not secluded from the world, but at the moment of encounter with it, in being within the world, with the world. The exile finds himself in paradoxical situation in which he is constrained to rationalize the facticity of his being there, not where he is supposed to be. In fact, not being there is the essence of his being. So exiles, by saying that we are not there, but there exists, that not being there actually becomes the essence of their existence, while trying to come to grips with where and what he is. All right, let's move on to chapter 2, say a few things about chapter 2. As much as chapter 1 was an internal or domestic investigation, chapter 2 is an external turn, an examination of Taste of Cherry's Palme d'Or success and the reactions that ensued. It contains a very extensive analysis of the film's formal and narrative aspects. The analysis is followed up by what anthropologist George E. Marcus calls a multi-sited ethnography. Quote, this mode of construction, the multi-sited space of research, involves tracing the circulation through different contexts of a manifestly material object of study, at least as initially conceived, such as commodities, gifts, money, works of art, and intellectual property. This is perhaps the most common approach to the ethnographic study of processes in the capitalist world system. Indeed, this technique is the heart of Wallerstein's method for fine-grained study of process in the world system. One of the advantages, unquote, one of the advantages of the multi-sited study reception is its ability to examine the striking disjunction among various viewing publics, understanding and reactions to a group of films representations of a nation. Hamid Dabbashi's close-up Iranian cinema, past, present, and future, Azadeh Farahmand's perspectives on recent international acclaim for Iranian cinema, and similar accounts examine local and global receptions in correlation with authenticity and truthful representation. In the chapter, I argue that the multiplicity of reception location makes it necessary to investigate reception as a multi-sited event and to think beyond conventional criteria of authenticity, such as local. And I think this is an answer to, and we can discuss it a little bit more in 10 minutes, to Dr. Moghimi's question. Authenticity such as local popularity and international success. The examples I have cited above suggest the reception of Taste of Cherry is dispersed in several sites, including Iran, International Film Festival Circuit, whose audience makeup includes Iranian diaspora and non-Iranians, Western art houses, and that's actually something that sounds a little dated. Art houses very seldom show films these days anymore, or exist for that matter. At least not in America. I'm not sure about Australia and New Zealand. Western art houses and critical and academic institutions. Let me continue with a clarification. Whether cultural objects such as artwork is a thing, a commodity, it is also a process. By treating an artwork as a thing, we may be implying the physical work, the canvas, the celluloid strip, even a digital file, and its meaning are one and the same thing. That when taste of cherries, cans of film, video, or DVD or digital file circulate from one site to another site, they travel with an original essence of the work, perhaps its intended meaning. Of course, no ethnographic study of the life of things would oversimplify the act of circulation in such terms. But there's always the risk of talking about the artwork as one thing. The subtlety of this point comes down to the simple fact that the shifts in meaning and understanding of a film or any other cultural artifact among different cultures presents us with not one thing, but rather several things. However, there is a difference between following a commercial commodity chain, such as clothing or high-tech products, and a cultural product or artwork, whose meaning is constantly renegotiated and reevaluated while moving within cultures. Okay, I'm only going to say a few things about chapter 3. I think we will be past our time. I'm going to speak for another 5 minutes, and then we'll have our conversation. In the conversation, I can say a few things about ethnographic nature of the wind will carry us. Chapter 3 represents what I think to be the book's most original contribution to cinema studies, so I agree with Dr. Moghimi, and the creative process as a whole. It starts with an ironic warning from the eminent 19th century German poet, Heinrich Heine, reacting to the news that the German government had rescinded censorship laws as a response to the revolutions of 1848. I can't write anymore. How can I write when there is no longer any censorship? How should a man who's always lived with censorship suddenly be able to write without it? All style will cease. The whole grammar, the good habits. So the basic questions are, considering that regardless of the local social structure, all social formations impose some sort of restriction or prescription or prescription codes. What do artists do in the face of these codes? Moreover, is the work of artists working in more severe sensorial environments always already contaminated and inauthentic? Not my word, the word of those who actually use the label. Like being infected by germs. Nothing produced in Iran after the revolution. The latter seem to be this. Sorry, I didn't finish the sentence. So everything that was produced in Iran after revolution was judged by a group of exiles and even people from Iran to have been some sort of government propaganda. The latter seemed to be the story that was accepted by Western media and the Iranian exilic community. Iranian films after the revolution were hidden in Islamic Republic government's propaganda. Not my words, their words. I mean, I'm talking about exilic filmmakers, Parviz Sayyad, Allamezadeh. I'm talking about various film critics that actually use the term inauthentic to refer to them, also use the term propaganda. It comes from a view that sees censorship as a veil, as a pair of scissors, as a pair of scissors cutting up the text. In other words, assumption is that censorship covers or mutilates an already truthful text or expression. Outside of Iran, everything is read primarily through the lens of censorship, therefore transforming the meaning according to the viewer's expectations. But these views are neither logical nor verified by historical evidence. I take a different view. Censorship, not only in Iran, but everywhere else, is a much more complicated process than this superficial view. Most of you are familiar with Stuart Hall's model. What is transformed and coded as a contract between the artist and the viewers, in Stuart Hall's phrasing, a circuit of encoding and decoding model of communication in which negotiated and oppositional viewing become possible. I extend this view to apply an idea of what I call structuring absences. And I'm going to explain this in a moment. Structuring absences, which makes the viewer more aware of what has been intentionally absented, made invisible and unavailable, than the absence that can delete from the equation. So I have a conversation, I have a short interview to read. It's only a few lines. It's between Deborah Solomon and Abbas Kiarostami. This is Deborah Solomon. As an independent filmmaker living in a repressive Islamic theocracy, are you harassed by the government? Kiarostami, they are very civil, but they don't allow me to screen my movies. Deborah, if your films are not shown in theaters, do Iranians know of them? Kiarostami, they can buy the DVDs on the black market. Solomon, it's odd that your films should be viewed as subversive when they are more philosophical than political and abound with picturesque views of the countryside. My favorite is Where is the Friend's House, in which a young boy walks all night to return his friend's notebook, which he took by mistake. Kiarostami, I don't have a favorite. When I see my old favorites, I can't stand 10 minutes of them. Either I have changed or the movies have become old. Deborah, unlike some other Iranian artists who fled the country, why have you decided to stay put? Kiarostami, I like my house. The only place I can sleep well is my own room in Iran. Deborah, seriously, how do artists in Iran deal with restriction imposed on them by the government? Kiarostami, it makes them more creative because art is the one positive thing they can get out of their life. Interview in 2007. Few aspects of contemporary Iranian cinema garner as much international attention and produce as much confusion as that of censorship. Take this interview as an example. Solomon fails to see the possible presence of political allegories and metaphors in the philosophical and visual aspects of Kiarostami's films, and neatly compartmentalizes all of them as independent and isolated categories, inferring that subversive films are recognizable as explicit political statements. We should also remember that there is a constant effort to frame Kiarostami's work as apolitical and non-threatening. In fact, throughout history, most of the influential works of art and literature that defy social conventions and mores have always relied on equivocation. By what, and I'm sorry for using the name, my sincerest apologies, because this is one of the most evil people who ever lived, but this sentence is not necessarily wrong. Leo Strauss, described as writing between the lines. Writing between the lines requires metaphoric insurrection, allegoric disguises, hidden ciphers, cryptic symbols, ambiguity, paradox, enigma, esotericism, and illicit changes in signs. Writing between the lines allows a writer to tell deadly jokes, to say one thing and mean another, to use praise to blame or blame to praise. It allows to play devil's advocate. Okay, so these are these are the things that are used in the film 10. Okay, now I want to just say one thing and then leave the discussion of chapter 4 because I see it's already way past 8. In chapter 3, I also spent quite a bit of time discussing the question of gender, representations of women, which actually has something to do with structuring absences. Kiarostami often in his interviews pointed out that he doesn't show interior spaces because he doesn't want to misrepresent. He has no problem with not representing, but he had a problem with misrepresenting a husband and a wife, in a house with their children, where the wife is actually wearing a veil. So yeah, by avoiding the interior spaces, it turned the figure of the representation of women into a structuring absence. Now, this is something that Laura Mulvey, in an essay, sort of an addendum to a book by Richard Tapper, an anthology by Richard Tapper, points out. And she was, in that sense, quite aware of a kind of like a very strong feminist tendency in Kiarostami's cinema. I discussed that's part of an essay that I wrote, I think in 2015. I'm not sure about the exact date, 2015 or 2014, published in a journal called Projections on 10, and it's called Neither Neither a Victim Nor a Crusading Hero. And in that essay, I kind of talk about this feminist term in Kiarostami's cinema. And I'm just going to stop here. Let's see if I have anything else. Yeah, and in the same essay and the same discussion, I talk about the representation of the figure of Amin in the film. Mania Akbari's son, who also plays her son, so both factually and fictionally, son as this as a sort of a voice of patriarchy, a figure that actually, once he opens up his mouth, is not so much he actually speaks as an institution, not just as a person. And I'm just going to stop it here and let the discussion take us into chapter 4. So I thank you all, and let me unshare.
Thank you, Dr. Khosrowjah. That was very good. I'm not sure how long we have, maybe half an hour. So I quickly start with one question. And please, if you have questions, just write in the chat box, then I can read it and Dr. Khosrowjah answer them. You criticize the colonial reading of national cinema through allegories. You said that these critics try to find some allegories and then connect those points that they find, the way that they read it, to the nation. Say that, I saw such a thing in the film, so Iranian or Iran looks like this. And then you continue by saying that Kiarostami resists this idea through a kind of cinematic form. This somehow is suggesting to me, correct me if I'm wrong, that we have a concept of national cinema, which is not what this colonial perspective trying to show, but it's something else that Kiarostami can represent it by resisting that idea. I want to know what is the national cinema then.
Okay, so the idea of a national cinema is we actually have a professor of anthropology here, so I'm very, very afraid to make statements about ethnography and anthropology. To Paula being here, I would like to hear others also intervene in what I'm going to say. So the idea of a national cinema is something that's formed similar to, think about it, this is something that the anthropologist Sidney Mintz says about national cuisine and national food, or we can think of it national music or anything else, is usually something that forms outside of the national boundaries and borders. In other words, when people go to a film in Iran, they don't see it as an Iranian film, right? Just to quote Roland Barthes, the Mexicans don't eat their food as Mexican food. They just, when they go to a restaurant, they order food. Okay. But the term Mexican food, French food, Italian food, in this sense, national cinema of Iran is a category, an entity that takes shape and is formed when it is outside of its own national boundaries. Now, having said that, there is always the fact that there is nothing homogeneous. Unless a country only produces 5 films or 6 films, but when a country makes tens of films or hundreds of films, usually the term national cinema is applied to the films that come in a particular circuit. So art films, for example. Okay. Now we might actually give you an example outside of Iran and then go back to Iran. Think of somebody like Kurosawa, Uzu, Mizoguchi as national cinema of Japan. That is partly true. But if you look at the film production in the 50s and 60s, tens of films were made by Toho Studios that were basically commercial films. Okay. So exactly where do you draw the line between something that you call national cinema having specific characteristics and something that is not necessarily doesn't come into a particular sensibility and any particular coherent genre definition. So when we think about commercial films, they usually are not placed within the boundaries of this national cinema. It's usually more, I don't want to use the term art directors, but mostly independent or filmmakers whose work is known outside of their own national borders. Okay. Having said this, the idea of resisting itself had for decades, for years, for decades, placed Kiarostami as some sort of autonomous auteur. Okay. So that actually was the usual approach to Kiarostami's cinema. His films were seen as the work of an auteur, like Bergman, like Antonioni. But what I did in this book, and this is why you see so many other films also being cited in the book, is to place him within the history and the culture, the film culture of Iran, but also show his particularity.
Thank you. I guess that is a kind of approach that we see in film studies a lot. They're talking about Iranian cinema, which again suggesting this idea of national cinema by selecting specific cases like Kiarostami. Then it brings this question that how national they are, especially when we talk about Kiarostami, that he didn't that much popular in Iran. He had more fan out of Iran among specific group of people, maybe mainly in academia. So then again, is that question that how this can represent national cinema and more broader like national identity, a nation, which is really interestingly connected to the idea of national identity that we discuss. Okay, who define the definition of Iranian, something that we also dealing with these days as well. So then it brings these ideas and question of who has the power, who is trying to construct these ideas, how these ideas are selected, articulated to construct a meaningful national cinema or national identity?
Okay, so going back to the idea of how we define a nation, let's start with something simple. Let's go to Benedict Anderson's um, imagined communities. That's kind of like a neat and kind of a clear model of imagined communities. How mass media, television, press, well, press no longer exists, but whatever exists as this sort of connective tissues creates this idea of an imagined community. Now, does cinema perform this? Absolutely. Cinema was one of the key players in the idea of creating an imagined community, even if the filmmaker is an oddball, even if the filmmaker is somehow the idea of opposition to a filmmaker, because I remember I've read so many negative reviews or reactions to Kiarostami that are countless. But at the same time, I look at the work of a lot of filmmakers who seem to be picking up on the formal qualities of Kiarostami cinema, that he is sort of like a nexus in Iranian cinema. But going back to the idea of a nation, the way that a nation is defined, and this is what I try to do in my book, is the 9 or 10 films that came, that left Iran and arrived in America or Europe, or I forgot what the expression that Masood used to refer to Australia and New Zealand together. Australasia, what was that term? Yeah, okay. New Zealand and Australia that kind of arrived on the shores of all these places, creates, first of all, debates. So it becomes part of a discourse about the national identity, what it means to talk about. So even if they are, let's say that the privileged upper middle class, the expats, Iranian expats in America, see a film by Kiarostami, and I saw that repeatedly. They became so upset that the representation of Iran was the countryside, and that was definitely inauthentic in their eyes. The discussions itself and the discourse itself was about how we define Iran. And that's why I use the term, that term of the fallenness, the, thrownness, that you find yourself in this situation and you try to define what the nation is and what the nationness, that the nationness itself becomes the point of discussion.
Thank you. Yeah, this is a very good point, like working on concept of imagined communities, because then we can think like we can focus on, I don't know, Hatami Kia or even Murtaza Avini saying that they have their imagined community and that can be national cinema as well. But then we can analyze like what are those powerful discourses or ideologies that imagine certain communities to construct people. In this case, Kiarostami, as you explained, it seems that this national cinema, Kiarostami himself, is constructed through the eyes of the big other, which are like non-Iranian Western perspective film festivals or film scholars in academia that construct this idea of national cinema, Kiarostami and his films, and connect it to the idea of Iranianness or mostly Persian, that is a tricky concept to talk
Actually,
about.
my experience was the exact, I mean, not the exact, but somewhat different from this, Dr. Moghimi. It was actually most Western scholars try to isolate Kiarostami. And instead of thinking of him as somehow being a sort of an exemplary Iranian filmmaker, to classify him, and this is what I say, that that I try to go against the grain. My study is going against the grain, is to classify Kiarostami more with Antonioni, Tarkovsky, to the other filmmakers of this sort of a very privileged status, as some form of an auteur that was autonomous and different. But when we talk about Hatami Kia, consciously actually makes the point of trauma, because Hatami Kia's films are mostly about representations of trauma, the revisiting of the trauma, which is kind of like the Glass Agency. We think about all the films in which he became the, from Karche to Rhine, etc. In his films, you see that his events and the events that are part of the dramatic, overarching structure of the film, all of them are related to a national experience. So Hatami Kia intention, Mahmal Baf too, Beizai too. All of these filmmakers are filmmakers who consider Bashu. Bashu is a very conscious reconstruction of this imagined community, okay? In terms of where Bashu comes from, the moment that the language is spoken by them all. All of these are very conscious constructions of the nation, okay? What I argue in Kiarostami, and especially in The Wind Will Carry Us, is the fact that those bridges that are built elsewhere are not built in Kiarostami's films. Kiarostami's films resist those bridges. And I'm not saying it's a good thing, I'm not saying it's a bad thing. It's just different.
So as you said that some Western scholars, they try to say that Kiarostami is an author. That means, I guess you correct me if I'm wrong, try to cut his relationship with the social, saying that this is an artist, lives in vacuum, believe in some artistic ideas or the way that he constructed his own philosophy to the world, and just making some statements or just show us how he sees the world. And that is why,
Yeah, beautifully put. Beautifully put. Because his films often are turned into these universal humanist statements, like isolation, about, kind of a sort of a Dostoevsky figure, sort of a, some sort of a figure in which, I mean, I'm not talking about his children's films, but films that he made later, as sort of an kind of like an isolated and meditative, let's call his films transcendental. Use the term transcendental filmmaker.
and that shows, I guess, what you also explained as singularity of his films, how it is like these films are singular. And comparing to someone like Hatami Kia, as you said, that he represents Truma. If we think about Hatami Kia and Kiarostami at the same time, we can see that Hatami Kia used Truma, say that we live in a world that I don't like it for any reason. It doesn't give me what it promised. So I need to get back to the past and like revive some ideas or use something to say to challenge what I have now or to criticize the system that I'm living with, that I represent myself as a supporter of it. Here we can see that the problem is that that subject is the subject of the Islamic discourse. Its critic is totally like nonsense because this discourse itself is that subject is digested in that discourse. So Hatami Kia cannot criticize that system because that's the system that created him. What Kiarostami does is he's not going to the past, he's going to the nature. So take us to a kind of vacuum. Like in that sense, probably Hatami Kia at least can be a little bit more critical or political comparing to Kiarostami. While in my opinion, this is personal opinion, none of them can trigger political identity or be critical in system. Go to the nature and show us, look, I'm in the vacuum. If war happened, that doesn't bother me. It's not my problem. I just see that there are some people still alive, even if it's war, and that is interesting. If earthquake happened, still you can see kids playing and they're happy, and that is what I appreciate. Whatever happened, I appreciate the life. And that life is part of that singularity. But the singularity gets its meaning in the relationship between the local and the global, not in the vacuum. Like in the vacuum, there is no singularity. You can be singular when you have relationship with the local and the global. And that relationship is a social relationship that can construct your perspective or your philosophy. So I really like to know what you think about that.
Yeah, I don't think that his films are actually taking place in a vacuum. First of all, consider this, because I think in your discussion, you somehow kind of cut off part of his oeuvre and kind of focus on a few films. Consider a film I forgot the name of the film, but it's called the case number one and case number two, in which you actually have the question of students showing loyalty or exposing the culprit. Okay, so that film definitely. I mean, I cannot think of another film in the post-revolutionary cinema which is more political. I mean, not only literally political, but also metaphorically, spiritually, ideologically more political. So I don't think Kiarostami actually his film take place somewhere, in the like a let's say Sukharov film, Mother and Son. They don't take place in that ether. They actually take place in specific, and even in film like A Taste of Cherry. Consider the characters that he picks up. An Afghan scholar, seminarian, a Turkish, Kurdish, or Lor, I forgot, Kurdish soldier. I forgot where the soldier was from. Anyways, Kurdish soldier, Turkish taxidermist, on and on and on. They actually seem that he's actually cutting a geographic swath in the depth, but they do at the same time. I mean, despite the diversity, at the same time, they don't seem to represent all the Turks, all the Kurds, all the peasants, all the. So, what I mean by singularity is not that they do not belong to a particular social grouping, class, caste, you know, background. But what I mean is that they do not, one does not stand for the universal. That's what I mean. And I'm using Rudy Visker's idea of singularity in that sense, in which actually Rudy Visker is a very, very political philosopher. But I'm using the idea that the fact that it resists being conflated into, it actually makes the viewer more engaged. Okay, instead of thinking that already knows that typical or archetypical or stereotypical peasant or worker or soldier. So that's what I mean by this. So I don't think that his films take place in a vacuum. Let's see if someone else has a question.
Oh, we have K1 saying, in my opinion, Kiarostami was not a political filmmaker in the traditional sense. His work is political. Nice, thanks, K1. I don't know how Dr. Khosrowjah liked that or not, because you're saying that it's making meaning through metaphors and I don't know. Can we please hear questions or share ideas from? Yeah.
So let's see.
Yeah.
I have Masood. Can we please hear questions or share opinions? I don't know, my opinion because I was not the political traditional in the traditional sense. Yes, Kevanja, completely agree. Not in the traditional sense. You're absolutely right. Not in the traditional sense. And he was always worried about, his famous thing. If you have a message, use a telegraph or use what did he use? What was the telegraph service? I forgot. Whatever they use, he, huh?
Alex.
Yes. Yeah. So, but what he believed was that that politics is actually, and he says it in his interviews, and the films actually represent him. His politics were more of more of a questions of political discourse. So I think, power discourse, power hierarchies, and you see those power structures in his films. Yes, he was not a political filmmaker in the sense that that Hatami Kia was, or Mahmal Baf in Marriage of the Blessed, for example, was. But politics. But he was aware that as soon as you roll down the window, outside world starts to pour in.
Yeah, I totally believe that all the filmmakers, all the artists, each of us, we are all like in
Yeah,
politics.
but
Whatever action is
you're,
political.
you're right. But a filmmaker like Tarkovsky, or a filmmaker like Sukharov, in that sense, I don't know why but both examples are Russian, but and kind of like a anti-communist Russians, not 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 revolutionary Russians. But the Sukharov and Tarkovskys of the world create universes that are intentionally outside of our own domain. They create these, other spaces, nether worlds. But Kiarostami's worlds are very, very kind of like as Renoir used to say, and my all-time favorite filmmaker Jean Renoir used to say, I want to make films that mud sticks to the boots. Okay, when people walk in the mud would stick to the boot. And I actually think that in Kiarostami's sense, you actually always feel the kind of like the heaviness, the gravitas of the world.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
Do we have more questions? Let me check the chat
Mahmoud
box.
has his hands up. Mahmoud John.
Oh, thank you very much, Professor Khosrowjah. Very fresh breathing at this time of horror and destruction. Was very informative, very nice put. It's not a question. I would like to hear your input about the censorship and creativity. That's kind of a debatable question that has been going around since the beginning of the censorship, wherever the date goes back. That there are like talking about my daughter actually in her thesis for her master degree input that censorship is actually good because it helps the creativity. Now, the question is that, like, for the filmmakers like Bresson or like Roberto Rossellini or uh, all the filmmakers, the big, well-known filmmakers that we know, there were no censorship, and they were still are the masterpieces of the cinema. So, what is your input about what Kiarostami says that censorship helps creativity? I would appreciate that.
Yeah. Okay. So this is like you said, this is kind of like a complicated question. And my chapter is the longest chapter. It's like 60, 70 pages that I have dedicated to this. Very briefly, just to say, first of all, censorship you can't actually kind of legislate censorship in order to promote creativity. It doesn't work that way. You can't say that, well, we have a bunch of uncreative artists. They seem to be completely uninspired. So why don't we kind of put censorship for they would become creative? It doesn't, it's not a reversible equation, okay? When there is censorship, artists have found ways to go through it, go around it, go above it. It doesn't mean that you need censorship in order to be creative. So in response to your question, the idea that censorship is required in order to create creativity, it doesn't work that way. But when there is censorship, you actually write through repression. That's a term that we could use, writing through repression. You can write through. In fact, the genesis of my argument, but I kind of like expanded, comes from Sigmund Freud's discussion of censorship that takes place in our dreams. how our dreams are actually our dream work is sort of a sensorial machine. We actually censor, we cut off things. So I use the mechanism, not that I think that you can use psychoanalytical arguments to talk about social structures that directly. But going back to the idea of creativity, the idea that censorship can stop the creative process has something to do with the question of desire, to the question of what it is that we want. In fact, one of the films written by Kiarostami called The White Balloon, it was the first film by Panahi. And in my opinion, Panahi's only good film is that the little girl, Ida, goes and, kind of checks out Snake Charmer. And they say, oh, you can't see it. You're a little girl. Go back, go out, get out. You can't be here. And she says, why can't I see it? They say, it's not good for you. You're not allowed to see it. And she says that I really want to see what I'm not allowed to see. Okay. So what I'm suggesting is that what censorship does, and this is true about every society, is that censorship, by repressing the mechanism of desire, what Lacan calls, that thing that you want, the objet petit, that little thing that you think is going to complete your life, actually encourages you to want that thing even more. In other words, censorship, by suppressing the desire itself, creates a much bigger demand for that thing that's been suppressed, that thing that is being put down. So the curtailing of the desire itself creates a need for it. Consider this: as kids, in the pre-revolutionary Iran, and also, if you grew up here or in Australasia, okay, sorry if I murdered it. If you're 16 or 17 and you go to a movie theater, which film do you want to see? The one that says no one under 21 allowed. That's the film that you want to see. In other words, the mechanism that asks you not to create, not to enter the prescription, actually creates sort of an excess for the desire to have that thing. And that's what I'm arguing, that censorship, to just put it in one sentence and move on to other questions, censorship creates the object that it tries to stop or prescribe or to ban. So the act of banning itself, don't do that, is exactly what your students will do in the class. Okay? Don't have that apple. You can have every fruit in the garden except for that apple. And what's the first fruit that you reach for? That apple. Okay? So what I'm saying is that this mechanism of desire actually is what defeats censorship in the first place. Now, the last sentence, Kiarostami makes a distinction between censorship and just random stopping of an artist's work. Sensorial process had a very codified you know exactly what is banned and what is allowed. So that there's a distinction between censorship as an institution with its codes. You can't do this, you can't do that, or some random process in which the work of someone is stopped or banned. So that there's a difference between the two, and I want to make that distinction between the two. Dear Golija has a question. Let's go to Golija's question. The question of authenticity and Iranianness of artwork. I think that any art that actually reflects the human experience that's produced by an Iranian artist is Iranian art. What do you think? Yeah, I agree. And that, I mean, we are talking about all, so culture is a place where you have contradictions. So you have artists like, Dr. Moghimi mentioned Hatami Kia. You have artists like Hatami Kia. You have artists like Kiarostami. So the fact that culture produces contradictory, you know, objects is a cultural, it's a fact of the culture. It has to do with class differences. It has to do with, well, all kinds of identity differences. That's part of it, but also taste and background and whatever it is that motivates the artist. So, is a work created by an artist? It is, Khosrowjah John, but there's also kind of like a gray area, and I'm sure that you agree with this, where you have an artist that creates. So consider an artist like Pilaram, the famed Iranian painter, was the art that he was making in Minnesota Iranian or was it Minnesotan? Okay, or an artist like Shirin Neshat. Is Shirin Neshat a New York artist or an Iranian artist? So in the case of exilic, diasporic artists, there is a gray area. And that actually has to do with their subjects that they treat, how they treat those subjects. If they kind of fall back on their homeland identity, then there is an Iran. They're rooted in their Iranian identity. If they are not, Amir Naderi, who made some of the most Iranian films, like smelled like the dust of the Kavir, made Manhattan by numbers, Manhattan by alphabet, films that were, not related. Or all the German and Austrian filmmakers who came to the US, they didn't make German films and Austrian films. They made films with Barbara Stanwyck and Fred McMurray. But they brought in a certain sensibility. The lighting that Billy Wilder uses, or Fritz Lang uses in his American films, is the lighting that they learned and created as German or Austrian expressionist artists. So you bring a certain sensibility from your culture, but you might actually so that's the gray area. That's the gray area.
Yeah, I just have a feeling that when we, the wider one can keep that circle, the better, because when you start excluding groups or people or ideas, then that becomes problematic.
Sure. I mean, did I give the impression that I'm
No, I agree with you.
I don't.
Yeah, to building on that, it's also important to explore the role of authorities, like who define what work can be, first of all, piece of art or not, and then what kind of art. We have Sohrab Shahid Saleh, great filmmaker, Wasat Taqvai, others who can also represent Iranian national cinema. But then we can compare like which kind of different channels represent these cinemas, these filmmakers, and what kind of uh, definition is attached to the process of filmmaking or their cinema. And that draws our attention again to how these discourses are constructing meaning for different types of cinema that we have: Iranian cinema, Korean cinema these days, and so on. Masujin, do we still have time?
Okay. Thank you very much. I think we've gone over time, but I'm sure we are also delighted, because as you see, the scope of this subject is quite vast, and Dr. Khosrowjah has done a great service, to introduce it to us and explain it. And also, we are really thankful for Dr. Moghimi to sparkle, the discussion further. And I'm sure, there are many other pressing questions about this wonderful character, Kiarostami, that we can explore by reading Dr. Khosrowjah's book, his first volume, and we looking forward to see his next publication of the second volume. And on that note, I really sincerely thank both of you for that wonderful presentation and also the participation of the audience. And I wish you all well and great to have you all.
And thank you, Masood John. Thank you, Habib John, Dr. Moghimi, and all the friends that I see here. My, best friends, Kayvan, Karen, my sister Sepide, the Afshin. We actually have quite a luminary of Iranian cinema, Afshin Hashemi, there, right there. Professor Paula Sensei. So Bay Area is well represented here. I wanted to thank my friend and also express pleasure for meeting new friends. And hopefully I see more of these new friends. So all the people that I'm meeting here for the first time, thank you for being here. And thank you, Master John, for giving me the opportunity.
Pleasure.
Thank you, John, for teaching me a few things that I'm going to take with me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, friends. So we say goodbye.
Okay, I also want to
And
thank
all the best.
everyone joining us for this beautiful meeting. Thank you, Master John. Thank you, Dr. Khosrowjah. I really enjoyed reading your book, and I suggest to everyone, if you have not yet, go buy the book, read it. It's very beautiful and nice and inspiring. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.